So early in my first year, he was interviewing for a clerk for the next year, and in comes John Edwards. And John was as charming then as he always has been. The next year, we were law clerks together, and I was from Welcome, and John was from Robbins, and nobody in either of our families had ever gone to college, and we were the same size, so we even traded clothes so it looked like we had more. For a rural boy from Davidson County, I've had a charmed life. But even with the opportunities I had, there were times where, I felt like an imposter, like a lot of us do. I didn't come from social settings. I didn't know which fork to use.
All rise.
All rise.
The Honorable Chief Justice and Associate
Justices of the Supreme Court
of the state of North Carolina.
Yes, oh yes, oh yes. The Supreme Court of North
All
Carolina
of our citizens across the state depend upon us to uphold and protect both the spirit and the letter of the law, and to always apply the law fairly and impartially to every litigant who comes before this court.
God save the state and this honorable court.
Good morning. I'm Mel Wright, the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. Very fortunate today to be here with Dean Rich Leonard of Campbell Law School. Dean, if you will, please, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm happy to do that, Mel, and it's great to be with you again. We've worked on a lot of projects together over the years. I'm a child of rural North Carolina. I grew up in Davidson County, a little farm village called Welcome. Two big farm families. My dad was a Leonard from Davidson County, my mother a Boger from Davie County. My dad was the 12th of 15, my mother the second of 4. So I grew up with about 15, 16 sets of aunts and uncles and about 40 first cousins. And that was really the contours of my early life.
Do I recall that you were a Moorhead Scholar?
I was, remarkably. I never believed it, but it did go my way. Nobody in my family ever gone to college. My dad was the only one of 10 boys who even finished high school. So the idea of even going to college was a little bit odd, but I was a good student. I think I liked to read from an early age. I read incessantly, and I think reading took me to other skills. And lo and behold, the letter came, and even though it was the last place on earth that my parents wanted me to go, they did not want me to go to that communist school.
And you're referring to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
I am. Now, I will tell you, after my brother and sister followed me there, my dad became the biggest Carolina fan on earth, but not before I went.
Tell us about the choice you had to make between law school or getting a graduate degree in education.
Well, if you go back to when I finished college, lawyers ran higher education in North Carolina. Bill Friday, the president of the university, was my hero, was a lawyer. Farabee Taylor, who was the chancellor, was a lawyer. Terry Sanford became the president of Duke. He was a lawyer. So it seemed to me if you wanted a career in education, which at the time I thought I did, going to law school was a good path to getting it. And people think it was hubris that when I tell them I only applied to Yale Law School, but it's because in my mind, and there's some truth to it, it was a more rounded legal education that equipped you to do different things than just the traditional practice of law. And it did serve me in good stead.
Good. Well, tell us about what happened after Yale Law School. Where did you start and how did
Well,
that
I desperately wanted to come home to North Carolina. I liked Yale and met a lot of terrific people. But I didn't. The dean once told me I was the only student he ever remembered who never went to a job interview at Yale. And I said, because nobody came to Yale that I wanted to work for. But North Carolina in the 1970s was a much more parochial place than it is today. And my Yale degree wasn't helping as I explored job possibilities. I thought clerking might be the way home. And even most of the judges preferred to take law clerks from their own home schools, usually Wake Forest or Carolina. And I had a disastrous run-in with Chief Justice Sharp.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, I got this surprise call from her assistant saying that she wanted to interview me to be her law clerk. And I got in my little Volkswagen and saved up my toll money and drove down to North Carolina in her chambers, and we had a lovely 15 minutes. And then she looked down at my file and looked up with those icy blue eyes, which I'm sure you remember. She could stare you down, and said with an abject terror in her voice, "Are you in law school at Yale?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, I misread your file. I thought you'd gone to Yale as an undergraduate and had the sense to come home for law school. I do not hire law clerks from Yale. Good day."
Oh, my goodness.
So I drove back to New Haven and thought it was never going to work out. But the two judges here who gave me serious interviews were Frank Dupree, the legendary federal district judge, and then the equally legendary Supreme Court Justice, Jim Exum. And I'd interviewed with both at the end of the summer. I'd gone back to New Haven. Past the time, either said they'd decide, thought it wasn't going to work out. And as I was leaving the law school one day, a buddy yelled, "There's a note on the bulletin board to call some judge in North Carolina." Prayed it was Exum. Went back in, it was Dupree. And called him, and as the protocol is, he offered me a 2-year clerkship. I took it on the spot. And honest to goodness, I rode home on my bike, and in the mailbox was the letter from Exum offering me the same clerkship. And I'd had a fairly stilted, staid interview with Dupree. He seemed older and conservative. I didn't think we'd see eye to eye on many things. Exum was this hip, young, motorcycle-riding liberal that I thought I'd have a great time working for. But you can be wrong about people. The relationship with Judge Dupree turned out professionally to be the pivotal relationship in my life. We were as close as a father and son. I did the eulogy at his funeral, and my youngest son is named Kane Franklin in his honor. He was one of the finest people I've ever known.
And you were with him for 2 years?
Well, I clerked with him for 2 years, but then I came back as his clerk of court. And then I was a magistrate judge. So I worked with him right down the hall for probably a total of 15 years.
But I'm sure you still stayed in contact with Judge Exum as well.
I've always stayed in contact with Judge Exum. We always, he said, he's always said to me, it was just a bike ride away from you having a career in the state courts.
That's right. That's right. A terrific judge. My first jury trial was in front of him, and he was terrific and was mindful of the fact that it was my first case. I've always respected and admired him.
Well, Judge Dupree taught me so much. He taught me about preparedness. He never went on the bench that he hadn't read every word of every brief or pleading that was the subject of the hearing, and often he'd even read the cases that were cited in them. He worked hard. He worked all of us hard. But he also had this enormous zest for life. We would laugh because he would change into his tennis whites at the afternoon recess, but leave his dress, black shoes and socks on under his robe. He looked rather silly, but he didn't want to waste a minute when he came off the bench at 5 o'clock in getting to the tennis courts. And the other thing I think he taught me that is, I think, underestimated was punctuality. He ran his court like a metronome. If he said you had a 15-minute recess, you had 14 and a half minutes to get stuff done. Hardest working guy, I think, in the building was the poor GSA man who had to climb the ladder about every day to try to get the clock in his courtroom synced with Judge Dupree's watch.
Anything else from a employment situation before I ask you about your experiences in Africa?
Well, I had a wonderful job, as a lot of these folks will know, because for 11 years I held what was called a combination appointment. I got to stay the clerk of court, but I also got to be a magistrate judge. So I had a 5th floor with 40 or 50 employees where I really ran the court. And then I went up to the 6th floor where I had a courtroom with some law clerks and tried cases. And it was a big life. It was a big life, but I really enjoyed it. And then I got to a point where I just really couldn't do it all anymore. It was just, there was a point where they were decentralizing administration of the federal courts to the local courts. So running the court had gotten to be a much more sophisticated job than it was when I started. And I was looking around for what I might do. And then all of a sudden, and sadly, Judge Mickey Moore passed away unexpectedly, who was the chief judge of the bankruptcy court. And there was a vacancy. And I decided to put my name in the hat, even though I didn't know a lot of bankruptcy. I certainly knew my way around the courtroom, and worked my way and got appointed by the Fourth Circuit and stayed on that court for 21 years.
Your book doesn't hide the disappointments that you had over the years. It's easy for outsiders to look at you and think of your career as one mighty ride to the top. Can you talk about the reality of a lifetime in law and the disappointments and setbacks along the way?
Sure. No, there were plenty, and I do think.
And excuse me for interrupting, but give us the title of your book.
So the title is From Welcome to Windhoek, A Judge's Journey. And as I said earlier, Welcome's the little village I grew up in Davison County. Windhoek was the last African capital of Namibia, where I spent a considerable part of time. So it seemed like the alliteration worked, and those were two good names for bookends for a book title. So it's gone well. Yeah, I think you're right. I think, we all make our resumes look great. We teach our law students how to do that, how to cover over the bare spots and embellish the good spots. And I think part of the reason I was so candid in this book is for the benefit of my students, because I think they do look at me sometimes through rose-colored glasses and think, you went to Carolina on a Moorhead, you were top of your class, you went to Yale, you clerked for the big federal judge, you practiced law with Senator Sanford, you came back to run the courts, you got to be a judge when you're 31. I mean, you never slipped. Well, I slipped a lot. I had personally, I was married to a remarkable woman who's a brilliant lawyer for 20 years, but it fizzled out. And I think all of us who've had that sort of occurrence in our life knows the toll it takes on you to process and get over that. Luckily, I had the courage to go again and been married now for more than 2 decades to the love of my life, so it does work out. And professionally, I remarkably got nominated by President Clinton to the Fourth Circuit in 1995 in my mid-40s. Had that worked out, I would have been there for a career and would have been the chief judge at some point. And when that didn't work out, he turned around in 1999 and nominated me to a vacant seat on the Eastern District. And again, Senator Helms didn't see it my way, so that didn't work out. And again, I would have been the chief judge of the Eastern District had that worked out. So having had a career in federal courts, and loving the job I had, but seeing those almost within my grasp was not an easy thing. But I don't look back much. For a rural boy from Davison County, I've had a charmed life. I've had more opportunities thrown at me than anybody could ever have. But even with the opportunities I had, there were times where, I felt like an imposter, like a lot of us do. I didn't come from social settings. I didn't know which fork to use. I never was quite sure what to wear to things because we didn't dress up much where I grew up. I remember, my first weekend at Yale, I asked a young woman who became a good friend, Levita Coleman, what she was doing for the weekend, and she said, "I'm going to Paris." I said, "For the weekend?" And she said, "Well, yeah, my dad's on the Pan Am board. I have a card. Anytime there's a vacant seat on a Pan Am flight, I can go anywhere in the world for free." I'm like, oh. I didn't even know that existed. So I think, and I think the message I'm trying to convey is not any greatness in me, for goodness sakes. It's just that you persevere. You just work as hard as you can. You treat people kindly. You treat people fairly. You outwork everyone, and it often works out.
How did you come in contact with Africa?
Completely coincidentally, as far as I know, I was sitting at my desk at an afternoon recess in the little courthouse in Wilson that I'd inherited from Mickey Moore. When you applied for this job, Judge Moore had miraculously persuaded Congress to build him a little courthouse in Wilson, his hometown, which he only got to occupy about a year before he died suddenly. And when you applied, they made it very, very clear that this job came with a courthouse, and they weren't going to argue about it. So
Right.
if you wanted the job, you were going to Wilson. So I was, and I loved it. I was there, and the phone rang, and this fella called, and he said he was from the State Department, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to go to Zambia as a consultant for their judiciary. And I said, sure, where's Zambia? And he explained that they had just amended their constitution to resemble Article 3, and they were setting up their administrative structures, and they had asked for some American judges to come as consultants. And so I said, well, I'll look at it. And he said, I'll call you back tomorrow. And I went home and did some research, and he called back the next day, and I said, fella, I am a tall, blonde Southerner with a considerable accent, and Zambia is a 100% black African nation. I don't think I'm going to be effective there. And he said, well, we think you will. The Zambians did not want a judge who was going to come talk to them about rule of law and separation of powers. They wanted a judge who had an administrative background to help them with systems. And everyone we've talked to has said, well, the only judge we know with that background is this guy in North Carolina. You ought to call him. So 8 weeks later, I was in Lusaka.
Wow. Well, tell us about how that went.
I thought it'd be a one-off. I'd give it my all, but I thought that's all that I would be able to offer. And it turned out that I knew things that they found really helpful. The judges, let me say, were really well-trained and really talented. Many of them, because I only went to Anglophone Africa, had gotten graduate law degrees in England or Canada, Australia. They're sophisticated men and women of the world, but they just didn't have any systems. Their courts were strapped for resources, and they didn't know how many cases were in the court. They didn't have any real tickle system. They didn't have much of a calendar system. If a lawyer screamed loud enough about his case, it might get in front of a judge, but otherwise things languished. And that was just music to my ears, because one of the things I'd loved about being the clerk of a district court was setting up a really fine case management system. And one of my favorite episodes I ever had in Africa was we built a pretty robust calendaring system for the high court judges. And Chief Justice Nialali had invited his whole high court bench, about 12 judges, into his chambers to show it off. And he turned to the only woman on the high court first, and her calendar came up, and it was impossible. I mean, multiple settings, morning, afternoon, civil trial, murder trial, impossible to do. He turned to the senior male on the court, and we thought that the software had malfunctioned because a straight line appeared down the middle of the screen, and we all simultaneously realized he only held court on Wednesday. And had been doing it for years, and nobody noticed.
Oh, we don't.
It was really the most powerful example of what an automated tool can tell you sometimes that your naked eye can't, that I'd ever seen. But Chief Justice Nialali looked at him sternly, and he said, I see why my lady is so fatigued. She will not be fatigued any longer.
What aspects of professionalism did you take with you to Zambia from your role as clerk of the federal district court?
Well, I think that part of the reason that my court was so successful when I was the clerk, and I'm not puffing here, it is true that when I came in as clerk, we were 73rd, I believe, out of 94 district courts in the speed of disposition of cases. And when I left, actually only 3 years later, we were 1. Wow. And what I did was this. I inherited a wonderful staff, mostly older women with high school educations who put pleadings in files. And that's what they did beautifully, and put it on the docket sheet. They didn't really know what it meant. And I started hiring these youngsters right out of Carolina and State and Shaw and North Carolina Central, and teaching them to be case managers, teaching them the rules of civil procedure, the rules of criminal procedure, and giving them authority within very circumscribed rules about how they can manage their cases. When they could call a lawyer and say, this pleading was due yesterday, where is it? And I think that made all the difference. And a lot of those folks, and it's one of the things I'm proudest of, I think 6 of them ended up running federal courts around the country over the years. So it was a good career start and a good career path for a number of them. And that part of what I took to Africa is you've got to overcome this incredibly hierarchical system that you have here. The gulf between judges and their staff was so enormous. Nobody on their staff could ever give a judge bad news. They wouldn't even turn their back on them. They would walk out of the room backwards, so they were facing the judge as they left. It was that formal. So it was very, very hard to make progress because a lot of the staff actually knew some things that should happen and should be done. But there was no way they could really get into a conversation with the judges about it. And that's where I worked a lot. I persuaded them to let me do a national seminar for all the senior, they called them registry officials. Each court had a registrar. Senior registry officials in Zambia, and brought them all together for 2 weeks, both as a morale boost and also to emphasize that they were very important players in the courts of Zambia and they need to be taken seriously. So of all the things I did that I took from here to there, I think that was probably the most significant.
Dean, in the book you make reference to a North Carolina lawyer by the name of John Edwards. It's very interesting to me to see what you wrote. Would you mind talking about that for a little bit?
I'd love to. Judge Dupree kept his law clerks for 2 years. So early in my first year, he was interviewing for a clerk for the next year, and in comes John Edwards. And John was as charming then as he always has been, and Dupree immediately offered him a job. So the next year, we were law clerks together and shared an office about the size of this table. And I was from Welcome, and John was from Robbins. And nobody in either of our families had ever gone to college, and we were the same size, so we even traded clothes so it looked like we had more. And we got to be bosom buddies. We became running buddies, which we stayed for 20 years. I probably run 10,000 miles beside the guy on a regular basis. But when I was in Africa, I'd done a little mountain climbing in this country, and my older son Matt was with me, and we were going to go up Kilimanjaro. And I wrote John. I don't know. I guess I called him. You barely had phones back then, and said, why don't you bring his son Wade, who was 16, over, and the 4 of us would go up Kilimanjaro together. And he did. And I made all the arrangements, found a porter. We went up the back hard route, which I caught a lot of grief for later for reasons you'll come to understand, and had a wonderful time. But it almost didn't work. Elizabeth Edwards, who we all know too, was so worried about Wade not being in shape that she'd sent him to Outward Bound to get ready, and so he came with huge blisters on his feet from Outward Bound, and we had a little trouble finding shoes that made him comfortable. And then the second night, my very polite son took a swig of water from the porter's jug and didn't go down well with how he felt that night. So every day it looked like we weren't going to be able to do it, but then we did, and we climbed for several days, and we got to about 18,000 feet, and John and I at the same time said, my head's killing me. And it was altitude sickness, which is the one thing that'll take you off that mountain. And we'd taken some pharmaceuticals with us that helped me a bit, but not him. And the night we were to go to the top, he was in dire shape. And I said, buddy, you just stay in the tent, and I'll take the boys. And, okay, well, we get ready to climb, and you know John, there he is in his cold weather clothes. He's not going to miss going to the top. We started up, and we climbed for about 2 hours, but he was so slow that he was slowing the boys down. And I finally said, John, what do you want here? And he said, I want Wade to get to the top. And I said, well, you got to stop, because we're none of us going to get there at this rate. It's too cold. He said, okay. So I took the boys and we went faster, and we got to the top at sunrise, and it was glorious, and we started down, and we were about 2 hours down, and here comes John with his sole Swahili-speaking porter who doesn't know a word of English, and they've been trudging up the mountain all night at a snail's pace. Wow. But John was spent, and so we worked out an arrangement where the porter and I took each end of his walking stick, and he held on to the middle, and we traipsed back up to the top. So I actually summited Kilimanjaro twice on that trip. But it was a great adventure.
Yeah. You mentioned watching a case being argued by the legendary civil rights attorney Julius Chambers, and being struck by the way he handled the case. What professionalism traits did you notice in Mr. Chambers' arguments and way he handled himself?
Well, this was one of the most fascinating days of my life, because I had shown up in Judge Dupree's chambers terrified a week early just to get the lay of the land. And on the docket this morning was the remand in Moody v. Albemarle Paper Company, which was one of the legendary Title VII cases decided by the Supreme Court. So it had been tried, it had been reversed by the Fourth Circuit, affirmed by the Supreme Court in a pivotal opinion, sent back for a retrial. And this was not the retrial, this was the motion hearings about the scope of the retrial. And I thought this will be interesting. Well, one of Judge Dupree's law clerks' wife had a baby the night before, and he was at the hospital. And the other called in and said he had the flu and a fever of 103, and he couldn't come to work. And Dupree said, well, I guess you're my law clerk today. And adding to my terror, he used his law clerks as his court crier. And he loved the old, long Superior Court chant that went on and on and on. And he wrote it on an index card for me. He said, but you can't carry that card in there. You got to memorize it. So I immediately wrote it onto the palm of my hand. And I got through the chant and got into the courtroom, and here was the scene. At the defense table was Whitford Blakeney, who was dean of the North Carolina Bar from Charlotte, who had been the defense counsel with a legion of junior partners and associates of paralegals. He had the entire record. And now, remember, it's been to the Court of Appeals, it's been to the Supreme Court, entire record spread out all over counsel table. And behind him were all the executives of the Albemarle Paper Company in Navy suits. And over at the plaintiff's table sat Julius Chambers with a blank legal pad and a pen. And behind him was the entire workforce of the paper company in Navy overalls. It was like a movie set. And Dupree was brilliant at oral argument. I mean, he had read the record. He had lots of questions. He interrogated counsel intensely. And I'd never seen anything like it. Chambers had complete mastery of that record that he didn't even have with him, down to page numbers and where the paragraph on the page was that answered Dupree's question. I just never seen that sort of intellectual performance by anybody. And he had lived with that case since those people came to see him and needed help 4 or 5 years before, and he knew everything about it.
Well, he was a remarkable lawyer. I was fortunate to be involved in a case that he was involved in. Went to the Fourth Circuit with him, and just remarkable lawyer. Tell me how you approach new students coming in. What does Campbell Law now stand for with you as the dean? How's that going?
It's going great. It's really, I mean, I couldn't be happier with the law school's trajectory. A couple of things. When I became dean 10 years ago now, I said you do two things. You look at what the school's already good at, and you enhance it, and then you look for new opportunities. Well, we were good at a rigorous curriculum. We were good at turning out lawyers with real skills. Our advocacy program was top flight, so I put a lot of effort into growing that. We're going to send 40 teams out from Campbell into national and international competitions across the country and world this year. Not cheap, but it is incredibly valuable to these students to fly to Los Angeles and take on UCLA or go to New York and beat Columbia. I mean, it's a big deal. So it marks their career there. And I thought the place we really lacked was in opportunities for experiential education. There just weren't enough chances for students to really get outside the building in our rich city and learn how to practice law. So we have a fabulous externship program. I've started 6 clinics around the city where my students actually, under supervision of very skilled lawyers, go out and provide needed services to the citizens among us who just can't afford legal services. And those have just been remarkable, and I've been excited about that.
Well, I want to thank you for all you've done and congratulate you on the success that Campbell has had with you as the dean, and I hope you'll stay there for a long time.
Well, you know, I'll end with this, and I use it a lot of times. Frank Dupree was such a legendary judge that often I would hear lawyers saying to him, "Whatever will happen when you're not here." And he would get a twinkle in his eye, and he would just say, "Another patriot will rise." And that'll happen in this seat.
Thank you for listening to All Things Judicial, a podcast of the North Carolina Judicial Branch. You can find out more about the Judicial Branch by visiting nccourts.gov. To find out more about Dean Rich Leonard's book, From Welcome to Windhoek, A Judge's Journey, please visit Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh, or wherever fine literature is sold. Thanks again for listening. I'm Chris Mears with the North Carolina Judicial Branch Communications Office, reminding you to keep all things judicial.